Cloud service providers give businesses the benefits of scalability, flexibility, improved collaboration, and business continuity. With many businesses moving to cloud computing, there is a need to ensure that the sensitive data of individuals and companies, whether at rest, in motion, or in use, is protected. In this presentation, we will consider the ethical issues surrounding data encryption in the cloud. More specifically, we will look at encryption through the lens of various prevailing ethical frameworks. These frameworks include utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, Aristotelian virtue ethics, and Thomism. We will then apply these ethical frameworks to the shared responsibility of cloud encryption. We will begin with a brief overview of cloud service providers, followed by a review and evaluation of the terms and conditions for Amazon Web Services and McAfee. We will then offer an analysis of the adequacy or lack thereof of the provider's encryption policies. Using our analysis and the ethical frameworks mentioned earlier, we'll identify and discuss some of the ethical issues surrounding cloud providers' terms and conditions and how they relate to encryption configurations. Finally, we will offer our recommendations within the ethical frameworks for how to use encryption within the shared responsibility of cloud encryption associated with AWS and McAfee. So what is a cloud service provider? The Microsoft Azure website does an excellent job of defining it. Simply put, a cloud service provider is a third-party company offering a cloud-based platform, infrastructure, application, or storage services. Much like a homeowner would pay for a utility such as electricity or gas, companies typically have to pay only for the amount of cloud services they use as business demands require. Cloud services are broken into three types. SaaS, or software as a service, is software that is delivered and licensed and accessed online by means of a subscription rather than bought and installed on individual computers. Some examples include services like Dropbox and various Google Drive services, such as Docs, Slides, Sheets, etc. PaaS, or platform as a service, is usually delivered as a complete development and deployment environment in the cloud. It includes resources that allow the user to deliver everything from simple cloud-based apps to sophisticated cloud-enabled enterprise applications. Examples of these include Google App Services and Microsoft Azure. IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, is an instant computing infrastructure that is provisioned and managed over the internet. It can be quickly scaled up or down to meet the demand needed. Each of these cloud services can help reduce IT costs, improve business continuity, provide greater efficiency and flexibility, not to mention the economies of scale they can provide. Before moving on, it is important to define the three states of data so that we can understand how encryption is applicable to each. Data at rest is exactly what it sounds like. Data is stored in a digital format. It is not being used, and it is not being transmitted. Data in use, sometimes called data in process, is data that is in an active use or in a non-persistent digital state in the context of manipulation by an application or being resident in active memory. Data in motion, or transit, is active data that is moving between devices. After careful review of the AWS customer agreement from Amazon Web Services and McAfee's cloud service agreement, it was interesting to discover that neither company assumes responsibility for the encryption of any kind. Even more surprising is that the only reference to encryption in each of these agreements is contained in brief statements to the effect that data protection is the sole responsibility of the contracting user. McAfee's only promise relative to data security in its customer agreement is that it will not share client data. McAfee does offer encryption as a secondary service that users can purchase in addition to the cloud services. AWS states that it's the user's responsibility to protect data. Even though Amazon doesn't assume the responsibility of protecting user data, it does provide its users with free protection tools in the form of strong encryption. However, the availability of these tools is not mentioned in the terms and conditions at all. It appears that in Amazon's opinion, this gives users the ability to secure their content. Separate from its terms and conditions, however, AWS offers as a reference manual its Amazon Simple Service Developer Guide. This 883-page document discusses the encryption AWS supports and how to manage and configure that encryption. In the guide, Amazon also recommends encryption prior to loading data onto its platform. The important takeaway is the recognition that both McAfee and AWS make it clear that encryption is not a default, nor is encryption mandated by either company. And while AWS makes encryption available as part of its services, it is incumbent on the contracting user to configure and manage the encryption. If the user doesn't take advantage of encryption, either server-side from Amazon or client-side before that data is uploaded to AWS, that failure is on the data owner. It is clear in the contracts that neither AWS or McAfee can be held responsible in the event of a data loss due to lack of encryption. Looking at each company's terms and conditions through the lens of ethical frameworks, we find differing, though sometimes similar, answers to the question, do companies need to offer default encryption? As we touched on earlier, the terms and conditions for both AWS and McAfee leave the option of encryption up to the purchaser of their services. From a utilitarian perspective, this poses significant challenges. To demonstrate this, let's start by recalling a few key elements of utilitarianism. First, actions that result in the greatest good for the greatest number are the right actions. Next, utilitarianism applies the same moral standards to all people in all situations. It is the outcome or consequences that matter, and good consequences matter most. So let's break that down. In the utilitarian framework, the best outcomes result in the greatest good for the greatest number. If we take the position that protecting data in the cloud results in the greatest good, then leaving the data unencrypted would be unethical. So it stands to reason that the terms and conditions for AWS and McAfee should include data encryption as a default. In support of this, we can look to several examples of breaches of data on AWS. For example, in 2017, Booz Allen and Hamilton, a technology consulting firm, discovered that 60,000 of its files were publicly accessible on an AWS S3 bucket. It exposed 28 gigabytes of data, including credentials of senior engineers and passwords of U.S. government systems and unencrypted passwords of government contractors with top secret facility clearance. Leaving encryption up to the companies using AWS's services clearly resulted in harm to individuals, corporations, and the U.S. government. In another breach example from March of this year, Data Deposit Box, which offers cloud backup services, exposed 270,000 of its customers' data files on an AWS server. The data included unencrypted plain text files containing administrator usernames, passwords, and more. And we can't forget the 2019 breach of Capital One, where 100 million credit card accounts and applications were exposed on an AWS server as well. These breaches demonstrate that leaving encryption as the user's option under the terms and conditions does not provide a greater good. The position isn't meant to advocate the idea that users of AWS and McAfee cloud services shouldn't have data security responsibilities. Indeed, in the utilitarian framework, data owners do have an ethical responsibility to protect data, including data in the cloud. Implementing data encryption should be expected of data owners, but the breach examples demonstrate that even experts can make mistakes. This was noted in a Wall Street Journal article covering the Capital One breach in 2019. In the article, Bob Diachenko, a cyber threat intelligence director at the firm Security Discovery, states, companies frequently make the mistake of storing unencrypted data in Amazon.com Inc.'s cloud servers. Knowing that, it seems clear that the greatest good for the greatest number would be for cloud services to not only provide encryption as add-on service, but to implement it as a standard of their service. Interestingly, when looking at the encryption policy, or lack thereof, offered by AWS and McAfee through a Kantian lens, the waters become muddled. Whether the company has a duty to offer encryption becomes more of a function of the type of cloud service being used rather than a binary yes-no rule. Kant believed that ethics and morality revolves around a concept of duty, that an action done from duty derives its moral worth, not from the purpose which it is to be attained by it, but from the maxim by which it is determined, and therefore does not depend on the realization of the robust of the actions, but merely on the principal volition by which the action has taken place, without regard to any object of desire. To put it simply, different types of cloud service offerings, meaning infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, have different duties connected with them. In an infrastructure as a service use case, the CSP is only providing infrastructure to the companies utilizing their service. This infrastructure can be thought of as a set of tools. We see infrastructure as a service akin to the tool rental service offered by Home Depot. For example, Home Depot has a duty to make sure their tools function as advertised, but they aren't responsible for what their users do with said tools. If a renter builds the next Eiffel Tower, then great. If the renter builds a structure that can't support its own weight, that isn't Home Depot's fault. Similarly, CSPs are responsible for making sure the infrastructure they're providing is adequate and maintained properly. What the company then does with the tools it rents is up to them. AWS and McAfee don't have an explicit duty to protect and therefore encrypt any data a company may host using the cloud infrastructure. In a platform as a service or software as a service use case, there is a different set of duties for the CSP because the company is renting services from the CSP. These use cases are not similar to the Home Depot tool rental service. Rather, they're similar to hiring a contractor to install, let's say, a new kitchen sink. If the contractor installs the sink but messes up the plumbing, the fault lies within the contractor, not the homeowner. In a platform as a service or software as a service cloud use case, the data companies are entrusting to the CSP is similar to the water in the contractor example. The data passes into the hands of CSP, and they therefore have an explicit duty to protect the data and not leak or endanger it in any way. One of the major issues in virtue ethics that arises within these terms and conditions is the idea of transparency. The terms and conditions themselves are taken verbatim, and there is little to no gray area when it comes to conflicts of interest. AWS and McAfee both lay out what is expected of the user of this service and how the provider will respond. As an example, let's revisit the Capital One breach that occurred in 2019. An internal employee of AWS was able to hack through a misconfigured S3 bucket, which allowed them to decrypt over 100 million credit card and social security numbers. Now, since AWS does not provide encryption through their cloud service, though it is available on the side, they take no responsibility for this incident. They claim that Capital One had incorrectly configured a web application firewall that was not offered by AWS. AWS, therefore, removed themselves from responsibility as stated in the user terms and conditions. Talking about virtues such as transparency, it seems that the idea of an initial encryption policy would strengthen some virtues while weakening others. For example, the idea of encryption would allow us to be less prudent when it comes to putting information on the cloud as well as less courageous. This would also increase the idea of liberality with putting information on the cloud. It is important to remember, though, that too much of a virtue becomes a vice and it quickly turns to prodigality. This sense of security with encryption is still not perfect, and the false sense of perfect security could actually lead to more harm than good. In one aspect, however, these service agreements do not follow a major point of virtue ethics when it comes to encryption. In their terms and conditions, the user is told that encryption is allowed. However, they do not clearly specify any best practices for the encryption. Virtue ethics is all about how to do good and not so much what good things are. AWS and McAfee tell us that encryption is a good thing to have, but do not educate us on exactly what good encryption policy is, or where any resources are to educate on encryption policy. Thomism provides a framework for inquiring into systems and reflects that knowledge can and should come from multiple sources to prevent dilemmas of stultification. Thomas Aquinas himself was one of the first theologians to derive ideas from non-Christian intellectuals such as Aristotle. The most impactful concepts derived from his conception of natural law and reason, whereby each one knows and is conscious of what is good and what is evil. While natural law explains the basic goods we all seek and value as individuals and how these aspects play a role in our daily life, reason lets us understand that people around us go through the same reasoning and preservation process. This is important to reflect on when observing AWS Cloud Service Agreement and its language regarding encryption. This natural law provides us as humans a framework to do good and help our peers. There is a lot to be said through the lens of Thomism about McAfee and AWS regarding their cloud service agreements and whether they are preserving themselves or their customers. Thomism is strongly grounded in reason, specifically in opposition to blind faith. As a customer relying on either of these services, by closely reading the cloud service agreement and doing some research, you will find out that there is some blind faith involved. In the 21st century, security and encryption can be considered as a basic good. As such, it will lead to a prohibition and a positive injunction. A prohibition of security and encryption would be, do not hack or access files without authorization, while the positive injunction would be, encourage and promote security. The concepts of Thomism discussed are directly related to Amazon's approach to their encryption services. As outlined in their cloud service agreements, you are responsible for properly configuring and using the service offerings and otherwise taking an appropriate action to secure, protect, and back up your accounts and your content in a manner that will provide appropriate security and protection. Amazon outlines the security features it offers to its customer base and lets them freely utilize their services both correctly and incorrectly, and assumes no responsibility for the results, placing it all on the client. McAfee also outlines the same type of information in their customer agreement, claiming no responsibility for encryption practices and standards. This is in direct conflict with Thomas' beliefs. The overall idea behind the natural law theory is that God equipped human beings with knowledge of all that is good and how to recognize it. AWS and McAfee are driving business globally, and it is an incredibly easy service to register for. Due to the massive availability of Amazon services on the cloud, this exposes inexperienced users to potentially misconfigure their security settings and leak customer data due to incorrect setup. The third basic good in Thomism is to educate one's offspring. This relates to the AWS case as they directly rely on the sustainable use of their platform. It is in their best interest to reduce the scope of a breach through the misconfiguring of encryption and security settings. If a user does not have the power to trigger an event that can cause substantial data loss, then that would reduce the number of data breaches caused by misconfiguration. As we've discussed, AWS and McAfee have left encryption to their customers. It fits within the ethical framework of Kantian deontology, and it appears to be counter to the frameworks of utilitarianism, Thomism, and virtue ethics. In fairness to AWS, the company does offer default encryption as a part of their basic feature set. However, it's not detailed in the terms and conditions, and the customer is left in the dark about it. From a utilitarian perspective, it would certainly make sense for the companies to offer some level of encryption as part of the basic feature set of their cloud product offerings. In addition, the company should make information about encryption easily available and digestible to their clients. We take easily available and digestible to mean that links to the information should be prominently available on their websites. The information should be readable in non-techie language that is clear and understandable. Encryption should be discussed as a best practice with potential consequences of leaving data unencrypted highlighted. Should the companies continue to leave encryption to the customer, the other recommendations could still be implemented. In that case, the discussion of consequences could include real-life examples that point back to part of the terms and conditions that states encryption is the responsibility of the purchaser. Up to this point, we have focused heavily on the CSP and what their duty is without going too in-depth with what companies who are purchasing cloud services should do. As stated earlier, when looking at choices through a deontological lens, duty is our primary driver. As the CSPs appear to already have structured their cloud service agreements with a Kantian foundation, our recommendation pertains more to the companies purchasing cloud services. Service-level agreements should be used by the consuming organization to explicitly define what encryption, including type and implementation, gets used, and whose duty it is to provide such encryption. How the individual SLAs will be structured will depend on the service being consumed. With infrastructure as a service, companies purchasing the service need to make sure that the SLA contains language that puts the burden of encryption on the consuming organization, not the CSP. The primary duty of the protection is the responsibility of the consuming organization, not the CSP. With platform as a service and software as a service, companies purchasing the service need to make sure the SLA contains language that puts the burden of encryption on the providing organization. In the case, the CSP takes over the primary duty to protect information in place of the purchasing organization. Though both companies do offer encryption standards or other resources, it is up to the client to find these on their own with little to no help from the companies. It is with this and the ideology from virtue ethics that we must educate others to do good that AWS and McAfee add resource links directly attached to the terms and conditions that lead users to best practices of encryption and the services that they provide to aid the user. This recommendation comes hand in hand with that of our utilitarian counterpart. If the user chooses not to read them and not follow them, then that is their choice. However, the material is there for them to use. In terms of governance for their encryption services, we believe it is best that under a virtue perspective that there is created an acceptable use policy for the encryption services they provide. Once again, remembering that too much of a good thing can cause just as much harm as having too little, it must be made that people follow the golden mean and don't drift into either excess or deficiency of security. This acceptable use policy for encryption should list out the appropriate uses, of course, for their encryption, but also the repercussions for breaking that policy and therefore the contract. It may also be beneficial for AWS and McAfee to provide training services or workshops so that what they preach can be easily placed into practice. They should have staff that travel to different companies that use their services to provide professional training and development of their services so companies can get hands-on experience with the new encryption policies put in place. Under Aquinas and his principles, Amazon should look to simplify and consolidate their security features into a clear format with material causes and effects depending on the client selection and industry. Similarly, with other ethical interpretations, it is in the cloud service provider's interest to be as transparent and assure their clients regarding any encryption concerns. By providing clients with an easier way to assure their data is encrypted and secure, it will reduce the amount of misconfigurations and potential breaches, as well as reduce the amount of blind faith associated with these agreements. Thomism also believes that one should educate and share knowledge. The prohibition of security must be relevantly addressed with a positive injunction of security awareness. The broad description of tools available and their effectiveness in each industry needs to be better explored through either a diverse set or a different set of contracts for each industry that clearly define which encryption tools are included. Outside of the configuration of the encryption that clients use and rely on, Amazon needs to provide sufficient security and language regarding their employees' access to clients' data and provide reasonable assurance that they are not abusing their power internally to take advantage. As we have highlighted throughout this presentation, there are unifying thematic elements that connect each of the ethical frameworks. CSPs should think critically about implementing our proposals in order to better serve and assure their customers, and in order to become a more trusted, ethical, and secure cloud service provider. Key in those proposals are the concepts of easy digestibility and the basic level of default encryption. Thank you.